Let me tell you how it all started. It wasn't with a bang or a scream or anything like that. It started with my voice talking to no one. Log entry, August 12th, 18:30 hours. Making good time on the 50, just east of Fallon. Weather's clear for now, but the sky to the west looks like a big purple bruise. Probably run into some rain before Ely. Diesel's holding steady at $4.90 a gallon at the last stop. Robbery. Coffee still tastes like burnt dirt. Over and out. I clicked the button on the handset of my little digital recorder and dropped it into the cup holder. It's a stupid habit, I know. Nobody ever listens to those logs but me. But it's part of the routine. And out here, on the road, routine is everything. It's the wall you build around yourself. You see, for a guy like me, the cab of this Peterbilt isn't just a truck. It's my office, my dining room, my castle, my fortress. Everything has a place, and every place has its thing. My thermos, the old silver one Sarah gave me for our 15th anniversary, is always wedged in the holder next to the log recorder. It's got dents and scratches that tell their own stories, each one a memory of a rough road or a sudden stop. On the dash, held up by a piece of curling tape, is the picture. Sarah and Lily, my girl, squinting in the sun at a 4th of July picnic from a few years back. Sarah's got that smile that always made my chest feel a little tight, and Lily, well, Lily's missing her 2 front teeth. I look at that picture 100 times a day. It's my North Star. The hum of the Cummins engine is a constant companion, a deep baritone I know better than my own heartbeat. The radio was playing some old George Strait song, the sound tinny and familiar. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, diesel, and the cheap pine tree air freshener dangling from the mirror. It was my world, predictable, safe, the only world I wanted when I was on the run. And I had my rules. You don't get to my age in this business without rules. Check your tires at every stop. Never trust the gas station coffee, but always drink it anyway. And the most important one, the one written in stone. You don't pick up strangers. Ever. Especially not on Highway 50. They call it the loneliest road in America for a reason. There's nothing out there but sagebrush, sand, and secrets. You pick up someone on the 50, you're not just giving them a ride. You're inviting their secrets into your world. And I had enough of my own. That bruise in the sky I mentioned on the log? It wasn't just a bruise anymore. It had split open. The change was fast, the way it can only be in the desert. 1 minute, I was cruising under a twilight sky. The next, the world outside my windshield was gone, replaced by a wall of black water. The rain didn't just fall, it came in sheets, hammering the roof of the cab like someone was unloading a dump truck full of gravel on top of me. The wipers, even on their highest setting, were losing the fight, smearing the water back and forth in frantic, useless arcs. Then the lightning started. It wasn't the kind you see in the distance. This was the mean kind. The kind that rips the sky in half right on top of you. A brilliant, blinding flash of white that bleaches the world of color, followed a split second later by a crack of thunder so loud it vibrated through the floorboards and up my spine. In those brief, silent moments of light, the empty desert became a nightmare landscape of stark, jagged shadows and twisted Joshua trees that looked like tortured figures reaching for the sky. I leaned forward, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes straining to see the white lines on the road. The country music on the radio had dissolved into a hiss of static. The only sounds were the roar of the storm, the frantic slap of the wipers, and the low growl of my engine. This was the part of the job I hated. The part where you feel small, where you realize the half-inch of glass in front of you is the only thing separating your safe, orderly world from the absolute chaos outside. It was during one of those lightning flashes that I saw him. It wasn't a clear sighting, just an impression, a flicker at the edge of my vision, a shape that didn't belong. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, a weirdly shaped piece of sagebrush. But on the next flash, he was still there, sharper this time. A person, standing on the shoulder of the loneliest road in America, in the middle of a biblical thunderstorm. He was just a silhouette, impossibly thin, standing stark still against the driving rain. One arm was slightly raised, not in a frantic wave, but in a slow, weak gesture, as if it was too heavy to lift any higher. My first thought was a curse. My second thought was the rule. Rule number 1. You don't stop. You just don't. This is how horror stories start. This is how guys like me end up a news report, a face on a milk carton for a week before everyone forgets. My foot stayed firm on the accelerator. I stared straight ahead, focusing on the slick, black ribbon of asphalt. Drive past. Don't look. He's not your problem. But I did look. As I got closer, another flash of lightning illuminated him. And that's when my resolve started to crumble. He looked like a kid. A teenager, maybe. Drenched, his dark clothes plastered to his skinny frame. His head was bowed against the rain, and I could just make out a mop of dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked less like a threat and more like a drowned stray. Leave him, the voice of experience in my head said. He could be on drugs. He could be a decoy for a carjacking. There are a million reasons he's out here, and none of them are good for you. But another voice, a softer one that sounded a little like Sarah's, whispered something else. He's going to die out here, Frank. Look at him. He'll get hypothermia in 10 minutes. Or a truck that isn't paying attention will smear him across the road. Can you live with that? I was wrestling with myself, a full-blown argument happening right there in the cab of my Peterbilt. The truck was eating up the distance between us. 50 yards. 40. I saw his head lift slightly as my headlights washed over him. I couldn't see his face, just a pale oval in the deluge. He's just a kid, I thought again, the feeling of it a knot in my stomach. What if that was my kid? What if, God forbid, something happened and Lily was on the side of a road somewhere, and every single car just drove on by, sticking to their rules? 30 yards. The rule wasn't just about safety. It was about peace, about keeping the chaos outside from getting in. This kid, this walking question mark in the storm, he was pure chaos. 20 yards. My hand hovered over the air brake lever. I could feel the thrum of the engine, steady, reliable. It wanted to keep going. It wanted to follow the rule. 10 yards. I swore, a short, sharp word that was lost in the thunder. And I broke my own damn rule. My hand pulled the lever. The world was filled with a deafening hiss, the sound of compressed air screaming in protest as the brakes engaged. It was a sound I knew intimately, the sound of control, of safety. But tonight, it sounded like a lock being broken. It was the sound of a fortress gate creaking open. The massive truck slowed, groaning, the tires fighting for grip on the wet pavement. I pulled over onto the shoulder, about 20 feet past the figure. For a moment, I just sat there, the engine idling, the wipers still fighting their losing battle. My heart was hammering against my ribs. What the hell did I just do? I glanced at the side mirror. The figure was trudging toward the truck, a slow, shambling walk, his head still down. I looked at the picture on my dashboard. Sarah and Lily, smiling in the sun. They represented everything I was trying to protect, the very reason the rule existed in the first place. And I had just spit on it for a waterlogged ghost on the highway. You're an idiot, Frank, I muttered to my reflection in the dark windshield. I reached across the passenger seat, my hand hesitating for a second over the lock. The air in the cab felt thick, heavy with my own indecision. Then, with a final, resigned breath, I pushed the button. The electronic click of the lock disengaging was small, insignificant against the roar of the storm. But to me, it was the loudest sound in the world. I leaned over and pushed the door open. It swung outwards with a metallic groan, and the storm rushed in. A blast of wind and ice-cold rain tore through the cab, whipping the pine tree air freshener into a frenzy and sending a spray of water across the dashboard, across the smiling faces of my wife and daughter. And through the open door, a shape emerged from the darkness, bringing with it the cold, the wet, and a silence that was far more terrifying than the thunder. He slid in, not like a person getting out of a storm, but like water seeping through a crack in a foundation. He didn't scramble or shake himself off or gasp with relief. He just folded his skinny frame onto the passenger seat and pulled the heavy door shut. The slam was definitive. It cut off the roar of the storm, leaving us in a sudden, muffled bubble of quiet. The only sounds left were the diesel engine's low rumble, the manic rhythm of the wipers, and a new, tiny sound. The slow, steady drip of water from his clothes onto my clean rubber floor mat. Drip, drip, drip. Each one felt like a tiny invasion. I just sat there for a second, my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes on the road ahead. The world outside was a black, liquid chaos, but suddenly the chaos inside the cab felt a whole lot worse. The air, which moments ago smelled of old coffee and pine, was now thick with the scent of wet asphalt and cold rain and something else, something I couldn't place. A damp, earthy smell, like a cellar that hadn't been opened in years. You know, in a situation like that, you're supposed to say something. It's what normal people do. You break the ice. So I tried. I cleared my throat, which felt dry as dust. Rough night to be out walking, I said. My voice sounded too loud in the confined space. He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, a statue carved from shadows, staring straight ahead. I was about to repeat myself, maybe a little louder, when he finally spoke. "It is," he said. That was it, just 2 words. But the voice, it didn't match the kid. He looked like he couldn't be a day over 20, scrawny and soaked, but his voice was flat. Empty. There was no shivering in it, no relief, no emotion at all. It was like a voice from a bad phone connection, all the warmth and life stripped out of it. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. The drip 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 from his sleeve was starting to drive me crazy. A small puddle was forming by his boots. It was a stupid thing to focus on, I know. A biblical flood is happening outside and I'm worried about my floor mat. But it was about more than that. It was about order. He was a dark, wet stain on my clean, predictable world. I put the truck in gear and eased it back onto the highway. The Peterbilt felt heavy, sluggish, like it knew I'd betrayed it. Headed far? I tried again, my eyes glued to the white lines that appeared and disappeared in the deluge. A pause. Then, far enough. Okay, Frank, I told myself. Just drive. The kid's probably in shock, half frozen. Give him a break. Maybe he's just not a talker. I'm not much of a talker myself. So we drove in silence. And it was the loudest silence I've ever been in. The slap 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 of the wipers was a metronome counting down to something I didn't want to meet. I risked a glance over at him. His head wasn't turned to the window, watching the storm. It wasn't turned forward, watching the road. It was turned just slightly, towards my dashboard. His eyes were fixed on the picture of Sarah and Lily. Now, lots of people notice the picture. A passenger, if I ever had one, might say, "Nice family." It's a normal thing, but he wasn't just noticing it. He was staring at it, studying it. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch, like he was running his cold, wet fingers over their smiling faces. It felt violating. I felt a hot knot of anger mixed with the cold unease in my gut. "I'm Frank," I said, a little more sharply than I intended. I was trying to break his concentration, to pull his eyes away from my family. He didn't look at me. His eyes were still locked on the photo. After a long moment, he whispered a name, so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the engine. "Alex." "Well, Alex," I said, forcing a normal tone. "Where'd you come from back there? Don't see too many towns on this stretch." He finally pulled his eyes away from the photo, but he still didn't look at me. He looked down at his own hands, resting in his lap. They were pale and still. Was visiting. Got left behind. It was an answer, but it wasn't an explanation. It didn't explain anything. The whole situation felt wrong, like a puzzle where all the pieces are the right shape but the picture they make is a nightmare. This kid, he was a collection of contradictions. He looked harmless, like a reed you could snap in two. But he felt dangerous. He was soaked to the bone, but he wasn't shivering, not even a little. His body was perfectly, unnaturally still. And his eyes kept drifting back to that picture. My picture. My family. I gripped the steering wheel harder. The leather was slick under my sweaty palms. My fortress didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a cage. A very small cage, and I just locked myself inside with something I didn't understand. I started doing the math in my head. Ely was still a good hour and a half away, maybe more in this weather. It felt like a lifetime. I had to get him to stop looking at the photo. It was making my skin crawl. It felt like he was memorizing them. "So," I said, my voice tight, "what are you looking at over there?" He turned his head, slowly. For the first time since he got in the truck, he looked directly at me. And I wished he hadn't. His eyes were the color of a washed-out sky, pale and empty. There was nothing behind them. No fear, no gratitude, no personality. Just blankness. It was like looking into the windows of an abandoned house. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before answering. His lips barely moved. A happy family. The words weren't a compliment. They weren't an observation. They were a statement, a diagnosis, like a doctor reading a chart. The flat, detached way he said it sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. All the half-formed fears and bad feelings I'd been trying to push down, they all came rushing up at once. This wasn't a kid in trouble. This was trouble. The rule number 1. I could hear it screaming in my head, a frantic, desperate alarm. You don't pick up strangers. My throat was too tight to speak. My world had shrunk to the space between my own terrified eyes and his empty ones. The storm, the truck, the road, it all faded away. There was only us, in this box, breathing the same stale air. He held my gaze for another long second, and then he turned his head back to the dashboard. Back to Sarah, back to Lily, as if our entire exchange had meant nothing. As if I meant nothing. There was just the picture. Then, he asked a question, his voice still that same, chilling monotone, that same detached curiosity. They must miss you a lot, huh? And then he smiled. It was the first time his expression had changed. It wasn't a real smile. It didn't reach his eyes. It was just a thin, bloodless line, a stretching of the muscles in his face that felt wrong, practiced. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my life. The lock I had broken open earlier, I could have felt it clicking shut again, but this time, I was on the wrong side of the door. That smile, it wasn't a human expression. It was like watching a snake try to imitate one. All mechanics, no soul. It dug into me, a hook baited with my own family, and it pulled tight. The cab, my fortress, suddenly felt like it was shrinking, the air getting thick and hot, smelling of wet wool and something sour that I realized was my own fear. I needed out. I needed air that he hadn't breathed. I need coffee, I said, the words coming out sounding like gravel. Gotta stop. There's a travel center up here. It was a lie. I had a full thermos of coffee, still hot, sitting right there in its holder. But I would have said my engine was on fire to have a reason to get out of that seat for 5 minutes. Alex didn't answer. He just let that bloodless smile fade away, leaving his face a blank canvas again. He turned his gaze back to the windshield, back to the hypnotic dance of the wipers against the black, roaring storm. It was like he'd just run a diagnostic on me, found what he was looking for, and shut the program down. Up ahead, a cluster of tired-looking lights fought against the deluge. Pike's Pass Travel Center. It wasn't one of my regular stops. In fact, I usually avoided it. It had a reputation. One of those places that feels like it exists in a pocket of time, forgotten by the interstate, a magnet for lost causes and bad luck. Tonight, it felt like an oasis. I pulled the big rig off the highway, the air brakes hissing in protest. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of other trucks parked at the far end, their engines rumbling low, their cabs dark. The main building was a low, flat structure with big plate glass windows. The fluorescent lights inside gave everything a sickly, greenish glow. I'll be right back, I said, my hand on the door handle. Don't touch anything. It was a stupid thing to say. A weak thing. A command I had no power to enforce. He didn't even acknowledge I had spoken. I just got out, slamming the door behind me and welcoming the cold, violent slap of the rain. For a second, just standing there getting soaked, it felt better than being in that cab. I hit the lock button on my key fob. The horn gave a short, pathetic beep. Locking him in, or locking myself out, I wasn't sure which anymore. The walk across the asphalt was like wading through a river. The wind tried to rip my jacket off. By the time I pushed my way through the glass doors of the travel center, I was soaked all over again. The place was just as I remembered. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke, burnt coffee, and disinfectant. A lone woman with tired eyes and hair dyed a brassy blonde stood behind the counter, scrolling on her phone. She looked up as the door chimed, her expression a perfect mask of professional boredom. "Rough one out there," she said, her voice raspy. "You could say that," I mumbled, heading for the coffee station. My hands were shaking. I wasn't even sure why I was here. What was I going to do? Call the cops? And say what? A kid looked at me funny? That he was quiet? That he didn't shiver when he was wet? They'd think I was crazy. I poured the burnt, sludgy coffee into a styrofoam cup, my eyes fixed on my truck through the rain-streaked window. It sat there under a flickering security light, a monster of steel and chrome. But it didn't look like my fortress now. It looked like a cage. A cage I'd willingly climbed back into, and then invited a predator in with me. The woman at the counter was watching me. "Everything all right, hun?" "Yeah, fine," I lied, walking over to pay. "Just, long night." "Aren't they all?" she sighed, ringing me up. I fumbled for my wallet, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. I dropped a couple of dollar bills on the wet counter. As she picked them up, I glanced out the window again. The light inside the cab was off. I couldn't see a thing. Was he just sitting in there in the dark? The thought made my skin crawl. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the cashier said, handing me my change. I forced a laugh that sounded terrible even to my own ears. "Just tired is all." I wanted to say more. I wanted to tell her, "There's a kid in my truck and something's wrong with him, really wrong." But the words wouldn't come. How do you explain a feeling? How do you put a voice to the instinct that's screaming at you from the deepest, most animal part of your brain? You don't. You look like a fool. I threw the full cup of coffee into a trash can on my way out the door. It wasn't about the coffee. It was about buying time. And my time was up. The walk back to the truck was the longest walk of my life. Every step was heavy. The wind howled in my ears, carrying phantom whispers. "You broke the rule, Frank. You broke the one rule." I got to the driver's side door, my heart pounding a frantic, trapped rhythm against my ribs. I took a deep breath, the rain filling my lungs, and pulled the handle. The door swung open and the dome light flickered on, illuminating the scene inside. And my world stopped. He wasn't staring out the window. He wasn't sitting still. He was leaning over the center console, ever so slightly. And in his pale, slender hands, he was holding the framed picture of Sarah and Lily. Not looking at it, holding it. He had taken it down from its spot on the dash. He'd crossed that line. He'd put his hands on my family. His thumb was resting on the glass, right over Lily's smiling 7-year-old face. He was stroking it, a slow, methodical back-and-forth motion. He didn't jump when the door opened. He didn't look startled or guilty. He just slowly, so slowly, lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were the same. Blank, empty, washout gray. "They have beautiful eyes," he said. His voice was that same flat monotone. It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment, an inventory. He held my gaze for a solid 3 seconds, the world shrinking down to the space between us, the storm and the engine and my own hammering pulse all fading into a dull roar. Then his eyes flicked down to the picture in his hands, and back up to me. "I bet they'll miss you a lot." That was it. That was the moment. The last piece of the ugly puzzle sliding into place with a sickening click. The thin veneer of denial I'd been clinging to, that he was just a weird kid, maybe on drugs, maybe in shock, it shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't random. This wasn't a kid in need. This was a threat, direct, personal, and sitting in my passenger seat. The words weren't a guess. They were a promise. He was telling me I wasn't going to make it home. Something hot and white hot surged through me. It wasn't courage. It was pure, primal rage. A father's rage. Without a word, I lunged across the seat and snatched the picture from his hands. My fingers brushed his, and his skin was cold. Not just rain cold. It was the deep, unnatural cold of a stone from the bottom of a river. He let it go without a fight. He just watched me, his expression unchanged. I shoved the picture back onto the dashboard, my hands trembling so hard I could barely fit it back in its slot. I didn't look at it. I couldn't. I slammed the door, threw the truck into gear with a grinding crunch, and stomped on the accelerator. The Peterbilt roared to life, tires spinning on the wet asphalt before catching, lurching us forward, out of the sickly yellow light of the travel center and back into the consuming darkness of the storm. We drove in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the awkward, uneasy silence from before. This was the silence after a declaration of war. The air was electric with it. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. My eyes were glued to the road, but all I could see was his thumb stroking the glass over my daughter's face. All I could hear were his words, echoing in my skull. I bet they'll miss you a lot. I was 100 miles past rational thought. My brain was just a frantic loop of what do I do? What do I do? Pull over and throw him out? In this storm? He knew what my family looked like. He might know more. What if he wasn't alone? The questions were a swarm of hornets in my head. And then, a new sound cut through the noise of the engine and the rain. It was quiet. So quiet, at first I thought it was just the wind. A low, soft humming. A simple, melodic little tune. It came from the passenger seat. I risked a glance. Alex was staring straight ahead, his head tilted just a fraction of an inch, and he was humming. A little nonsense tune. A three-note melody that went up, then down, then up again. A tune I knew better than my own heartbeat. It was the little song Sarah had made up years ago to get Lily to sleep when she was a baby. It didn't have words. It wasn't from any movie or radio show. It was just theirs, our little family secret, a piece of music that, as far as I knew, only existed inside the walls of our house. My blood didn't just run cold. It felt like it evaporated. My hands went numb on the wheel. The road ahead blurred, the white lines swimming in my vision. The storm outside was nothing. The real storm was in my cab, and it was humming my daughter's lullaby. The world outside was a black, roaring mess of water and wind, but inside the cab of my Peterbilt, the only sound that mattered was that low, tuneless humming. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. In fact, if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it altogether, written it off as a squeak in the suspension or the whine of the turbo. But I was paying attention. I was paying attention so hard it felt like my skin was peeled back, every nerve ending exposed to the charged, dead air between us. It was a nothing little tune. Just three notes, really. Up, then down, then back up again. A loop, a simple, almost childish little melody. And my whole world fell apart. You have to understand. That wasn't just some tune he heard on the radio. It wasn't from a commercial. It wasn't a song at all, not really. It was a piece of our life. It was the little sound Sarah, my wife, had made up when Lily was just a baby, when nothing else would get her to stop crying. A little nonsense hum she'd do while rocking her in the nursery, the moonlight coming through the window. It was the sound of my home. It was the sound of my family's private, quiet love for each other. As far as I knew, that melody didn't exist outside the three of us. It was ours, and this thing in my passenger seat was humming it. The blood didn't just run cold in my veins. It felt like it solidified, turning to a block of ice in my chest. My hands, which had been clenched on the steering wheel, went numb. I could feel them there, but they were like lumps of clay, disconnected from my brain. The white lines on the highway swam and blurred, two hypnotic snakes leading me deeper into the storm. For a second, a crazy, stupid second, I tried to rationalize it. A coincidence, a 1 in a billion fluke. Maybe some other family 8,000 miles away had the same dumb little tune, and maybe this kid happened to hear it. It was a desperate thought, the kind a drowning man has when he mistakes a floating log for a rescue boat. But I knew, in that deep, animal part of my brain that had been screaming at me all night, I knew. This was no coincidence. The humming stopped. The silence that rushed in was somehow worse. It was heavy, and it was watching me. I didn't turn my head. I couldn't. I just kept my eyes locked on the road, on the frantic back and forth of the wiper blades fighting a losing battle against the rain. My voice didn't sound like my own when it came out. It was rust and gravel, a sound scraped from the bottom of my soul. "Where?" I growled, the word tearing at my throat. "Where did you hear that song?" From the corner of my eye, I saw his head tilt, a slow, deliberate motion. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the engine, the rain, and the frantic, trapped bird flutter of my own heart against my ribs. I could feel his eyes on the side of my face. I didn't need to see them to know they were flat and gray and empty. Then he smiled. Not the big, ugly smile from the travel center. This was smaller, a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. It was a predator's smile. A smile that knew it had its prey cornered. "I just hear things," he said, his voice still that infuriating, passionless monotone. "Here and there. It's a nice tune, though. Catchy. Catchy." The word hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just threatening me. He was mocking me. He was taking the most private, precious piece of my life, a sound that meant safety and love, and he was turning it into a weapon. He was telling me, without saying it, I've been close. I've been listening. I know you. The rage from before, the hot flash at the travel center, was nothing compared to this. This was a deeper, colder fury. It was the fury of a man who realized the walls of his castle had already been breached, and he hadn't even known it. He wasn't at the gates anymore. He was already inside. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, a stupid, primal instinct to just run. The big diesel engine roared, and we tore through the black, churning night. I needed a plan. I needed to think. But my brain was just a loop of that three-note melody and his flat, dead voice saying catchy. Throw him out. That was the first thought. Slow down, pull the door handle, and kick him out into the storm. But I'd seen him. He'd seen me, and he knew my family's lullaby. Throwing him out didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The beginning of him coming back to find them. It was right then, in the absolute peak of my panic, that a new sound cut through the cab. A crackle, a burst of static, the CB radio. I usually kept it on, just for the background chatter of the other drivers, a connection to the world. Tonight, it had been silent for hours, drowned out by the storm. But now, it sputtered to life. A voice, tinny and laced with static, but urgent. Repeat, be on the lookout. Patient escaped from the White Pine Regional Secure Facility near Ely. Male, Caucasian, early 20s. Last seen wearing dark, wet clothing. Approach with extreme caution. Individual is considered highly volatile and dangerous. My eyes shot from the road to Alex. Male, Caucasian, early 20s. Dark, wet clothing. It was him. Of course it was him. A wave of something that felt sickeningly like relief washed over me. It was an answer. A terrible answer, but it was an answer. He wasn't a demon. He wasn't a ghost. He was a lunatic. An escaped psycho from a funny farm. It made a twisted kind of sense. The weirdness, the silence, the lack of affect. He was just crazy. But the relief only lasted a second. The radio crackled again, the voice fading in and out. Has a history of crackle, fixation on, hiss, family units. And then the lullaby echoed in my head again. Fixation on family units. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a crazy person I happened to pick up. He had chosen me. He had been watching. And the lullaby wasn't just a tune he'd overheard. It was his research. The broadcast died, swallowed by another wave of static, leaving a ringing silence behind. The revelation hung in the air between us, thick and poisonous. He was a patient. He was dangerous. He was obsessed with families. And he was sitting 2 feet away from me. In that dead silence, as my mind tried to process the CB broadcast, my gaze dropped from his face, down his arm. His hand was resting on his lap, half hidden by the loose, dark sleeve of his jacket. The cheap dome light and the glow from the dashboard instruments were dim, but they were just bright enough. Just enough to catch a glint of something. For the first time, I saw what he'd been holding. It wasn't a knife. It wasn't a gun. It was a small, tight coil of wire. Thin, like the kind you'd use for a fence, but cleaner. Shinier. And even in the terrible light, I could see the little metal thorns, the barbs, twisted into it every few inches. It was wrapped neatly around his palm, the end tucked securely, ready to be pulled free. It wasn't something you just find. It was a tool, a weapon made for a specific, horrible purpose. Something to be used up close. Something to bite into flesh. That was it. That was the moment every piece clicked together with a final, deafening snap. The picture of my family. The cold, assessing eyes. I bet they'll miss you a lot. The lullaby. The radio warning. And now, the wire. This wasn't a disturbed kid in need of help. This wasn't a madman babbling nonsense. This was a predator. A methodical, patient predator who had done his homework. And I had broken my one rule and invited him into my fortress. I was driving a monster down the loneliest road in America, and he was humming my daughter's song while holding a garrote made of barbed wire. My body went into overdrive. Adrenaline, pure and undiluted, flooded my system. The numbness vanished, replaced by a hyper-awareness so intense it hurt. I could feel the rough texture of the steering wheel, hear every individual drop of rain as it hammered the roof, smell the sour scent of my own fear. The world slowed down. My only thought was survival. Get him out. Get away. Get home. I was contemplating my next move, a desperate calculation of speed and road conditions and the chances of me winning a fight against a man holding barbed wire, when God or the devil decided to finally make a move. There was a flash of brilliant, blinding white light that lit up the entire sky, turning the black night into a stark, overexposed photograph for a split second. It was followed not by a rumble, but by a sound so loud it felt solid. A cataclysmic crack that vibrated through the frame of the truck, through the seat, and into my bones. The lightning had struck close. Too close. The dashboard lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. The purr of the radio died. The gentle hum of the heater fan spiraled down into silence. The engine coughed, sputtered, and went dead. The wiper blade stopped mid-swipe, frozen on the glass. The only lights left were the headlights, casting two weak, dying beams into the deluge before they too flickered and faded into nothing. We were plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. We were a dead hunk of steel, coasting to a stop in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a biblical storm. The only sound left was the drumming of the rain on the metal roof. And in that sudden, total blackness, the thing in my passenger seat moved. He turned his body towards me. I couldn't see him, but I could feel the shift in the air, the change in pressure. The humming was gone. The silence was gone. He took a breath, a calm, measured intake of air. His voice, when it came, was completely different. The flat, robotic monotone was gone. This voice was clear. It was calm. It was intelligent. And it was colder than any storm. Time to talk for real, Frankie. The silence that fell wasn't just the absence of engine noise. It was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the cab, thick with the smell of ozone from the lightning and my own cold sweat. The drumming of the rain on the roof was no longer a comforting background hum. It was 1,000 tiny fists trying to beat their way in. In the total blackness, I felt more than saw the shift of his body on the passenger seat. It was a deliberate, unhurried movement, the pressure changing on the worn vinyl. I could feel his stare on me like a weight. Then came his voice, and it was all wrong. The dull, empty monotone I'd been listening to all night was gone. Just vanished. What replaced it was clear, calm, and measured. It held an intelligence that was 100 times more terrifying than any madness. Time to talk for real, Frankie. He called me Frankie. Nobody calls me Frankie except Sarah, and only when she's teasing. The sound of that name, in that new voice, in this dead cab darkness, sent a tremor of pure, undiluted ice down my spinal cord. My hands were still on the steering wheel, but they didn't feel like my own. They were stone. You have to understand, I'm a fan, he continued, his voice so reasonable it was obscene. A real student of your work. The consistency, the routine, it's beautiful in its own way. Predictable, safe. The Peterbilt 379, always fueled up at the Flying J outside Salt Lake. The double cheeseburger, no onions, at the Greasy Spoon in Austin. The phone call home, every single night at 9 p.m. on the dot. You are a masterpiece of routine, Frankie. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a rant, it was a report. He was listing my life like a series of data points. The darkness wasn't a hindrance to him, it was his stage. I could picture him in the blackness, a faint, predatory smile on his face, enjoying this. But the best part, he went on, a new warmth in his voice that was somehow colder than the ice, is the home. The fortress at the end of the line. 1428 Willow Creek Lane. A nice little slice of the American dream. A bit of a squeak in the third step of the front porch, you should probably fix that. Sarah, she likes hazelnut creamer in her coffee, doesn't she? Sits on the porch swing in the mornings, reading. She has a lovely profile. Every word was a nail being hammered into my coffin. He wasn't just a psycho who got lucky. He wasn't some random lunatic. He was a hunter who had been stalking his prey for weeks, months. He knew the squeak on my porch. My castle walls hadn't just been breached, they had never existed. They were glass, and he'd been looking in the whole time. The fury I felt earlier was a flickering candle compared to the supernova of rage and terror that erupted in my chest. It was a rage born of absolute powerlessness. And Lily, he said, and my blood stopped moving altogether. Lily's pink bicycle with the sparkly tassels on the handlebars. She's always forgetting to put it in the garage. Leaves it right there on the lawn. School gets out at 3:15. Redwood Elementary. She walks home with that little girl with the red pigtails. They always stop for a slushie at the 7-Eleven on the corner. A sound escaped my throat. It was a strangled, pathetic noise like a dying animal. He had watched my daughter. He had watched my little girl. The lullaby. Catchy. The image of him, this thing, standing across the street from her school, watching, cataloging her habits, it broke something inside me. The fear was still there, but it was being cooked in a pressure cooker of pure, homicidal hatred. You see, Frankie, I was getting a little bored just watching, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The observation phase was over. I needed to see the system under stress. Introduce a new variable. And then tonight, you broke your own rule. The one, simple rule you live by on the road. No riders, ever. You saw me standing there in the rain, looking all pathetic, and you took pity. But you need to understand something. He paused. In the suffocating silence, I heard a faint, dry rasping sound. The sound of that barbed wire being slowly, lovingly uncoiled from his palm. Your kindness tonight wasn't a rescue, he said, his voice now devoid of all fake warmth, leaving only the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. It was an invitation. That was it. That was the moment my brain stopped trying to process and just acted. There was no plan. There was no logic. There was only the primal scream of a cornered animal that had just been told the predator was already in the den with its young. The world outside was a black, churning void of a storm. The world inside was a tomb waiting to be sealed. I was driving a 2-ton monster, and for the first time all night, I realized it wasn't just a fortress. It was a weapon. My mind didn't go blank. It went crystal clear. One road, one choice. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, my feet slamming down on pedals that did nothing. But the momentum was still there. We were still coasting, a ghost ship in the storm. With a roar that came from the depths of my soul, I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The world tilted. The big rig, heavy and graceless, lurched off the pavement. There was a sickening lurch as the passenger side wheels left the asphalt and hit the soft, muddy shoulder. For a split second, we hung in a state of impossible balance, and then gravity took over. The Peterbilt plunged down the steep, rocky embankment. The cab became a centrifuge of chaos. The thermos I'd had for 10 years shot past my head like a silver bullet, shattering against the back window. The logbook, my maps, loose change, everything that wasn't bolted down became a projectile. We weren't falling, we were tumbling. The shriek of twisting metal was the only sound in the universe. I was thrown against my seatbelt, the strap digging into my collarbone with enough force to snap it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him coming for me. He wasn't screaming. He was a shadow moving with purpose through the maelstrom. In the violent, unpredictable lurches of the cab, he launched himself across the center console. A searing, white-hot line of pain bit into the side of my neck. The barbed wire. He had one arm braced against the dashboard to steady himself and the other was pulling the wire tight. The tiny metal thorns dug into my flesh. I could feel warm blood starting to well up, slick and hot against my skin. My hands clawed at the wire, but it was thin and vicious, the barbs catching on my fingers. Panic gave way to pure, feral instinct. I wasn't Frank the trucker anymore. I was an animal fighting for its life. My left hand, bloody and torn, shot out blindly, searching for a weapon, for anything. My fingers brushed against something hard and heavy, wedged between the seat and the door. The maglite, my big, 4D cell, heavy as a brick maglite. My fingers closed around the cold, knurled aluminum. With a guttural scream, I twisted my body as much as the seatbelt would allow and swung. It was a wild, desperate arc in the dark, aimed at the general direction of his head. There was a wet, sickening thud that I felt through the handle of the flashlight more than I heard it over the groan of the crashing truck. The pressure on my neck lessened instantly. He grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and his weight shifted off me. The truck hit the bottom of the ravine. It wasn't a stop. It was a collision with the planet itself. The sound was a physical blow, a cataclysmic crack-crunch scream of metal folding in on itself. My head whipped forward and slammed into the steering wheel, and the world exploded into a brief, brilliant flash of white stars behind my eyes. The entire frame of the cab warped, the windshield imploding in a shower of glittering cubes. The final impact sent a shockwave through the chassis, and with a sound like a gunshot, the passenger side door, already weakened and twisted, burst from its hinges and flew open. Time seemed to slow down. The body that was Alex, limp and stunned from the blow of the maglite, was no longer held by gravity. He was just dead weight. As the cab settled on its side with one last shuddering groan, his form was ejected through the open doorway. I saw his silhouette for a half-second against the gray, rain-swept darkness, a tangle of limbs tumbling out into the night, and then he was gone, swallowed by the storm and the black, rocky embankment. The world was sideways and screaming. Not a human scream, but the tortured shriek of 10 tons of metal dying all at once. For a second, there was just pressure and noise. The seatbelt felt like a steel bar trying to cut me in half, and my head was full of exploding fireworks from where it had met the steering wheel. The air, thick with the smell of diesel and hot wiring, tasted like blood. Then, silence. A heavy, broken kind of quiet. The only sounds were the hiss of the rain on hot metal and the frantic, animal drumming of my own heart in my ears. The cab was on its side. Through the spiderweb cracks in the shattered windshield, I could see the muddy embankment, rain-slicked rocks, and the whipping branches of sagebrush. He was gone. The thing that called itself Alex had been thrown out, a piece of human garbage ejected from my world. My first thought wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was a single, primal command that echoed in the very marrow of my bones. Get out. Run. I didn't look at the empty passenger seat. I didn't want to see the space he had occupied. I didn't dare look out the gaping hole where the passenger door used to be, for fear of seeing him getting back up. My right hand, the one that held the maglite, was numb and shaking. I let the heavy flashlight drop with a thud onto the ceiling, which was now the floor. The barbed wire had left a string of fire around my neck. I could feel the wetness, warm and sticky, soaking into the collar of my shirt. With a grunt that tore at my throat, I unbuckled the seatbelt. I fell a few feet, landing in a heap of logbooks, maps, and shattered plastic on the driver's side door. The pain in my collarbone was a sharp, grinding agony, but the terror was a fuel that burned hotter than any pain. I scrambled upwards towards the broken windshield. Glass crunched under my boots. My hands, cut and bleeding, found purchase on the twisted dashboard. I hauled my body through the opening, tumbling out into the mud and the storm. I landed hard on my hands and knees. The cold Nevada mud sucked at me, a mixture of dirt, rain, and probably my own leaking diesel. I didn't pause. I didn't look back at the mangled wreck of my Peterbilt, my fortress, my home on the road. Looking back meant seeing, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that if I saw him, I would die. So I ran. I ran back up the embankment, slipping and sliding, my lungs on fire. The wind and rain were a solid wall trying to push me back down. I reached the edge of the highway, the empty, black asphalt stretching into infinity in both directions. There was no plan. I just picked a direction, away from my truck, and ran. My boots slapped against the wet pavement. Each breath was a ragged sob. I wasn't running like a man. I was fleeing like an animal that had just chewed its own leg off to escape a trap. The things he'd said churned in my head. 1428 Willow Creek Lane. Lily's pink bicycle. She has a lovely profile. Every word was a spur, digging into me, pushing me onward. He wasn't just in my truck. He had been in my life. A ghost walking through my memories, turning everything safe into something tainted and horrible. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? An hour? Time had stopped making sense. My legs turned to lead, the fire in my lungs became a crushing weight, and the adrenaline that had propelled me finally ran dry. My vision started to tunnel, the blackness at the edges closing in. I tripped over my own feet and went down, hard, sprawling onto the wet highway. I tried to get up, I really did, but my body just wouldn't obey. I lay there, face down on the cold, wet road, the rain washing the blood from my face into the asphalt. This is it, I thought. He'll just walk up behind me. I closed my eyes, waiting for it. Instead of a footstep, I saw a light. It grew brighter, painting the wet road in a blurry glow through my eyelids. A sound followed, the deep rumble of a diesel engine and the hiss of air brakes. The light washed over me. I heard a truck door open, then heavy boots on the pavement. "Jesus Christ, buddy, you all right?" a voice boomed, thick with a southern accent. I couldn't answer. I just grunted, trying to roll over. A big, rough hand grabbed my shoulder and helped me. I was looking up at a barrel-chested man in a flannel shirt, his face etched with concern under the bill of a baseball cap. He was real. He was normal. The sight of him was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The next couple of hours were a blur of flashing lights, scratchy blankets, and questions I couldn't really answer. The highway patrol, the paramedics. They wrapped my neck, put my arm in a sling, and sat me in the back of a warm ambulance. I kept telling them, there was another guy. A hitchhiker. He was in the cab. He went out the door. They listened, they nodded, they wrote things down. A couple of troopers with big flashlights went down into the ravine to search the area around my wrecked rig. They were down there for a long time. When the sergeant came back to talk to me, his face was professional, but his eyes were full of a kind of pity. "Mr. Franklin," he said, calling me by my last name. "We've done a thorough search of the crash site. There's no one else down there. No body, no tracks besides your own letting away from the vehicle. The rain's pretty heavy, it would have washed a lot away, but we found nothing to indicate a second party was involved." "But he was there," I insisted, my voice cracking. "He had wire, he was talking about my family." The sergeant gave me that look. The look you give someone who's just survived a major trauma, whose brain might be playing tricks on them. "You took a nasty knock to the head, Frank. It's common for the mind to get jumbled after a crash like this. We think you were fighting sleep, you drifted off the road, and the rest, well, the trauma cooked it up. You're lucky to be alive. That's what matters." They didn't believe me. To them, it was an open and shut case. A tired trucker who wrecked his rig on a lonely road. I was the crazy guy. The guy who imagined his own attacker. I stopped talking then. There was no point. I had no proof. My monster had vanished into the storm, as if he were made of rain and shadow to begin with. The next few weeks were a strange kind of purgatory. I was home, which was all I wanted, but home didn't feel safe anymore. I'd see Sarah on the porch swing with her coffee and my stomach would clench. I'd watch Lily ride her pink bicycle down the street and the urge to scream and lock her in the house was so strong it made my teeth ache. I fixed the squeaky third step on the porch. I made Lily put her bike in the garage every single night. I was trying to patch the holes in my fortress, but I knew the walls were made of glass. The insurance company declared the Peterbilt a total loss. They were processing the claim. I was on medical leave, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do with the rest of my life. I couldn't imagine getting behind the wheel of another truck. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on Highway 50, the road stretching into a dark, hungry mouth. About a month after the crash, I got a phone call. It was a guy from the insurance company's risk assessment department. His name was Peterson. "Mr. Franklin," he said, his voice all business. "Just following up on the incident report. We've been reviewing the assets, including the CVR from your cab's black box. The cockpit voice recorder. I'd completely forgotten about it. The little box that records everything said in the cab for safety and liability." "Okay," I said, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, well, it's mostly standard stuff," Peterson continued. "Static, engine noise, the radio. We got the audio from the crash itself, which was, intense. But there's something on the tail end of the recording I can't make sense of. Our protocol says we should check with the driver if there's an anomaly. It sounds weird. You mind if I play it for you?" "Go ahead," I said, my hand tightening on the phone. There was a click, and then I was listening to my own nightmare. I heard the final, terrible groan of my truck settling into the mud. I heard the wind and the rain. Then, I heard my own ragged, desperate breathing, the sound of me scrambling out of the wreck, and the fading sound of my own footsteps as I ran for my life up on the highway. Then, for a long time, there was only the sound of the storm. It was an eerie, peaceful sound now, knowing what it was hiding. The rain slowly softened from a roar to a patter. You could hear the occasional tick-tick-tick of the truck's engine cooling. It went on like that for what felt like forever. Okay, here, Peterson's voice cut in. Listen close now. This is about 20 minutes after you fled the vehicle. The sound of the rain continued, softer now. And then, a new sound cut through it. Footsteps. They weren't my frantic, panicked footsteps. These were slow, calm, deliberate. Squelching in the mud, they were coming towards the wrecked truck. My entire body went cold. I stopped breathing. The sound of the footsteps stopped right next to the cab, right near the recorder's microphone. A moment of silence, then a voice. It was a voice I'd never heard before, low and calm. It held no alarm, no surprise. It was the voice of a man checking on a job. Did he get away? My heart stopped. It just stopped. I felt the phone slipping from my sweaty fingers. And then, another voice answered. A voice I would hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. It was his voice, the thing that called itself Alex. But it was different now. All the personas were gone. The empty monotone, the intelligent predator. This was just a voice. Normal, casual, almost bored. Yeah, he's gone, Alex said. It's fine. The road is long, and there's never a shortage of kind people. A beat of silence. Then I heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of a car door closing a short distance away. An engine turned over, a quiet sedan, not a truck. It purred to life, and I heard the sound of its tires rolling slowly away, leaving the sounds of the dying storm and my dead truck behind. The recording ended. Mr. Franklin, you there? Peterson asked, his voice sounding a million miles away. Weird, right? Sounds like some other folks stumbled on the wreck. Guess they just looked and left. Anyway, I'll just make a note of it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I let the phone drop from my hand. It clattered onto the hardwood floor. He hadn't been a drifter. He hadn't been a patient who escaped. He wasn't a lone madman. The cold certainty that washed over me was worse than any physical blow. He was a scout, and he wasn't alone. They hadn't been hunting me. They'd been shopping. My kindness wasn't an invitation. It was a test I had passed. And my escape, my survival, wasn't an ending. It was just a temporary setback for them. A minor inconvenience. Because the road is long, and there's never a shortage of kind people. And they are still out there, driving those empty highways, just waiting.